The following podcast is offered freely through the Insight Meditation Community of Washington and by Jonathan Foust. To learn more or to make a donation to support this work, please go to www.jonathanfoust.com. There is a classic teaching story that goes way back. If you can imagine, right about this time of night, just as the dusk is coming and it's getting dark, in a small village, this young boy is out for a walk before going home and going to bed. And in the middle of the road, he almost steps on a snake. And he freaks out and runs home. And all night, he's just shaking with fear. And shaking with anxiety, just the fear of going out in the morning and encountering that big snake again. So after a long night of anxiety, he very, very cautiously, goes outside and begins to very gingerly walk down the street again, and he sees that snake is actually a piece of rope lying in the road. And I love that story because it really makes me wonder how many snakes in my life are actually just ropes. I was going to talk tonight about anxiety and insomnia, but I knew I'd be up all night worrying about it. So I thought I'd just talk about anxiety. I've always thought of myself as kind of the poster boy for anxiety. It's been really come in my default from a very, very young age. But the more I talk with people and work with people and kind of research the topic, the more I've really come to appreciate how pervasive anxiety is and how crippling and paralyzing anxiety is, particularly in our culture, with all of the stimulation and so much going on. We have this default that goes toward anxiety, at least I certainly do. On Saturday, I was doing a 9-mile paddle on the Potomac, and my phone rang, and I just looked at it, and it was out-of-town number, and I instantly thought, the dog. The dog has run off, a stranger has found the dog. And just like that, we move toward the worst case scenario. Unfortunately, I like to always quote Mark Twain, who said, the worst things in my life never actually happened. So anxiety is a future-oriented mind state. And at its core is a sense of distrust and doubt. It's kind of an irrational form of fear. And the bad news is that it's pervasive. And the good news is that it's possible to free yourself from that mechanism of anxiety, fear, anticipation. There's so much to talk about. This could easily be a series of talks, but I'd like to just touch on some of the fundamentals. And one thing I won't talk about is post-traumatic stress, because that's a whole topic unto itself, which is a fascinating exploration. But I would like to talk about tonight a little bit about what anxiety is, what the experience of anxiety is like, about the roots of anxiety, when you can really pause and investigate anxiety, and some strategies as to how you might get more of a handle on it, find a way to be in relationship with it, and transform your relationship to it. And really to talk a little bit about what it means to cultivate resilience in the midst of so much stress. So anxiety is there all the time. It's pervasive. And there are all the studies that have said that public speaking is one of the biggest forms of anxiety, even more than death. So at a eulogy, most people would prefer to be in the box than actually giving the eulogy. But I heard this talk about someone who was giving his first public talk. It was at his town Rotary. So there was a podium and the American flag, and he was so nervous. And as he was giving the talk, he just was sort of fidgeting a little bit, and he kind of kept tucking his shirt. His shirt kept coming loose. He kept tucking his shirt down the back of his pants. And at the end of his talk, he started to walk away, and he had tucked the American flag down the back of his pants. So that was his pattern of anxiety. But it's interesting to reflect when you get anxious. What's your pattern? How does it show up? Do you become fidgety? Do you get very quiet and withdraw? Do you talk more and get more animated? Do you start doing things to soothe that anxiety? Do you get angry? Do you get hyper-focused? Do you find yourself distracted where you can't focus at all? Or do you go numb? Find yourself kind of going blank? Or do you find yourself getting fatigued? Or you just don't have the energy to meet what is coming in your direction? You could translate anxiety as stress. We all have aspirations in life. We all have goals that we set for ourselves, and then we're beset by everything that gets in the way of achieving those goals. We get very caught in what we could call a future-oriented mind state. We want things to be a certain way. And when we can't reach those goals, that registers not only in our thoughts, but it also registers in your body. There's so many different manifestations of anxiety, the different phobias that show up. Different anxiety disorders such as social anxiety. There's obsessive compulsive disorder, different eating disorders, post-traumatic stress, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorders, and what are called reactive disorders, how you respond to big stressors like divorce or losing a job. A lot of times, our anxiety arises in relationship to our need for control. It's the sense that when you're losing control, that's when the anxiety gets really, really chronic, and it can easily go over into panic, where we have a sense of actually losing control. So it's interesting to observe how much of our anxiety is related to the future. And much of the healing of anxiety is coming present. And we'll talk more about that. And for some of us, anxiety comes, it might get chronic, and then it goes. And for others, and I think for myself for much of my life, anxiety felt more like a low-grade fever, just kind of a low-grade anxiety in the background, just a general sense that something's not quite right, I'm not quite safe. And for others, it becomes quite chronic, where the anxiety never ever seems to loosen its grip. We have a tendency in our culture to label anxiety as bad. But really, anxiety is a part of being an intelligent person. To be able to anticipate what might go wrong is actually the function of a highly intelligent brain. The intelligence reveals options to you. And worry, chronic worry or anxiety, is the anticipation of an unpleasant outcome. But really, it's the worry that keeps us alive. As we like to say, you have a nervous system. It scans for danger. But when that worry settles in and becomes chronic, it not only compromises your clarity, your sense of well-being, it compromises your health. Your entire nervous system gets severely compromised by chronic anxiety. Someone once shared with me this experience, and I had noticed it, but he articulated it so well. Maybe you've had this experience where you wake up in the morning, and there's just sort of a general sense of well-being, and then very slowly you can watch the software programs booting up, and by the time your feet hit the floor, you're in anxious mode. Can anyone relate to that? So mindfulness is about being aware of what is present. And through mindfulness, or non-judging awareness of what's present, it's the beginning of new possibilities, where you can actively investigate these states as they arise. You can investigate anxiety. And it begins to help you identify the cause. What's at the root of what's arising? So, as I mentioned before, I have a real love of being on the water. I spend almost every day, sometime on the Potomac on my paddleboard or a kayak, and I have my GoPro mounted on the front of the paddleboard, and there's a very interesting little clip where you can see on the paddleboard that it's very, very calm, and it kind of goes by a rock, and then suddenly it goes like this. And what happened, this was about 2 weeks ago, as I was kind of making my way up, right by some rocks, I bumped into a rock, and there was a large snake that for about half a second was trying to decide if it was going to jump on the board or go into the water. In that half second, my heart almost exploded out of my chest, and you can see it in on the paddleboard there. I've had a history with snakes. My first memory was about 4 years old on the farm where I grew up, and I just looked down and there was a big snake wrapped around my ankles. Total freak out. And since then, I've had some really interesting encounters. When I was in high school, I was portaging a canoe down a rocky embankment in this Whitewater River in northern Pennsylvania. Big 90-pound aluminum canoe, and I kicked over this big rock, and right behind the rock was an extremely annoyed rattlesnake. And the next thing I remember, this was maybe like a 60-foot incline. It took me about 15 minutes to make my way down. The next thing I remember, I'm up on the road going, and then years later, rock climbing down in Utah, I had a close encounter with another rattlesnake right by my foot, and I've told that story before. But it's interesting to notice how, for me, around snakes, that with this history of trauma, if you will, that has built up a whole story in my mind. And how just the other day, I was out again on the river, and there was a snake kind of swimming across the river, and I kind of tracked it with my boat for a while, and then it went under. And then I thought, maybe it's launching a counterattack. And I turned around and went the other direction. So perhaps you know that feeling of things that you chronically avoid because you've had an unpleasant experience. And I actually have spent time examining my phobia with snakes, because if I didn't, I'd never go outside again. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can work with phobias, how you can work with the events that send you into a kind of a chronic reaction. There are over 40 million people with anxiety disorders. And there's so much shame around anxiety. Most people feel their anxiety is unique. And as Werner Erhard said, 40 million people thinking they're unique is not unique. When you just pause and examine the sources of stress in your life, they may include traumatic experiences that you've had, personal relationships where there's intimacy that has either been challenged or betrayal, experience of death, of stress at work, stress at school, stress with finances, medical illness. A lot of anxiety can come from side effects from medication, substance abuse, brain chemistry, genetics. They all play into this chronically anxious experience of life. And the signs are noticing when you get lost in excessive worry. If you have difficulty controlling worry, where the mind is like just this hamster on the wheel that just goes back again and again without resolve. And some of the external signs of anxiety are restlessness, fatigue, irritability, muscle tension, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating. These are all kind of the external signs. So looking through the Buddhist lens, it can be interesting to look at the root of anxiety through the lens of what are referred to as the three poisons, the three mental states that interfere with being present or with your true nature. One of them being greed. And this element of greed or chronic craving has to do with the mental state of having expectations that are way beyond what's realistic. We're constantly caught in trying to be something more than we can be. Have you ever noticed that the goals you set for yourself are always a little bit beyond what's reasonable? And what that does is it reinforces a constant state of not quite there. It can be an interesting way to motivate yourself, but it also reinforces a sense of a self that's just not quite enough. So we're caught in this constant state of grasping, never, ever, ever quite arriving. The other form of these poisons in the mind is aversion or ill will or hatred. And this is the negative self-talk that we tend to carry. It's another form of not being enough. And so much of anxiety is related to the shoulds. Anywhere the word should, I should be, I should do, is a seed for anxiety. The third of these mental poisons is delusion or confusion. It's believing things are true that are not true, or believing things aren't true that are true. And this is oftentimes very much a part of a chronically anxious mind, is we anticipate the worst possible outcome. There's a story I read online as I was doing a little research of someone was writing on one of the forums about feeling anxious about flying. Because when she was a little girl, she once got sick on a plane, and she hadn't flown in a long time. And so she had a list of everything that she was bringing with her. You know, it was amazing. You know, she was bringing her Dramamine, her ginger, acupuncture bands, Xanax, and she was still terrified. And she went on to describe her sort of this mental nightmare of being confined on a plane and being sick and so forth. So there's a term in Pali, the language of the Buddha, called papancha, which literally translates as proliferation. That we get caught into a negative thought and then we expound on that. So just getting on a plane becomes this horrible, terrifying nightmare. And what often happens is we feel anxiety about something. The mind continues to obsess on the worst possible outcome. The body responds in a form of kind of chronic tension, anticipating the worst, and we begin to feel like we're losing control. The more we struggle, the more we find ourselves moving into panic, which is just the sense of suddenly we lose control and we're overwhelmed by that experience of anxiety. But stress is normal. It happens. Sometimes it's chronic. Sometimes we lose our balance and we get overwhelmed by strong mental and emotional states. And sometimes we get caught. But the question then becomes, how do we let go? How do we move through these states of anxiety when they arise? Another classic teaching story, which I've mentioned many times, but for those who haven't heard it, I find it so helpful. The story of a woman, yogini, who's meditating in her cave. She's visited by 3 demons. The 3 demons are whirling around the cave, doing their best to terrify her. And she quietly gets up, starts building a little fire. She's so non-reactive, the demons get really irritated, so they crank it up a little bit more. And she continues to very quietly putting a little water on a tea kettle and puts it over the fire, and this enrages the demons. So they throw everything they've got at her. And again, very quietly, she puts out these teacups on the table. Finally, they stop and they say, "What is going on? Were your 3 worst nightmares, your 3 deepest wounds, and here you are building a fire, putting this water on, putting out these teacups. You know, what gives?" And she says, "You've been here before, you'll be here again. So in the meantime, what kind of tea would you like?" To me, that's the practice. Having tea with your demons. When you realize that you're being visited by a demon, and one of the best translations of demon simply is energy. There's an experience of energy. It may have a mental component, but you'll feel it at the same time. How do you have tea with it? And I'd like to talk a little bit about that process, but first I'll tell you a really embarrassing story. I have never lived in a metro area in my life. I grew up on a farm. I always lived in the country. I managed a farm through college. I've always enjoyed living in the woods. So when I met and fell in love with my wife, and it made sense for me to move down here, I had a little bit of anxiety about it. But right about that time, this was about 10 years ago, someone handed me an article that was written really, really well. And it was about these missing suitcase bombs from Russia and how some ex-FBI, CIA person said there are these missing suitcase bombs through Chechnya, and they're hidden in all the major cities in the West, and they're in sleeper cells. And I thought, what am I doing? I'm moving from the woods to the number one terrorist destination on the planet. And I was actually, I started getting a little obsessed about this. And you know how it is sometimes when your mind just gets a hold of something and won't let it go? Because I really thought, am I making the stupidest mistake in my life by going down to this wild area? So this mental proliferation wouldn't stop. It was just papancha all the time. And the more the time got closer for me to move down, the more anxiety I felt. And so there are 3 strategies that I employed. We've talked a lot about about this acronym of RAIN, which is kind of the mindfulness strategy for cultivating transformation. The R, recognize what's presenting, realize what's happening. A, sense if you can allow it or if you can accept it. The I, to actively investigate, to be intimate with that, to have tea with that. And when you can do that fully and completely, it gives you, you arrive in that place of N, like you're not as identified as you were before. So a lot of the initial investigation, when you turn your attention to anything that's arising that's between you and feeling free, is primarily, just as we do in mindfulness meditation, we're not so focused on the thoughts as we are on the experience of here and now. So with anxiety, it becomes a great opportunity to really explore, where do I feel that? How is that arising energetically? And what happens is, there's sort of this proliferation where you move from sensations, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. We go into a thought. The thought hardens into a belief. The belief becomes a habit. The habit becomes your character. The character becomes your destiny. So we're guided to the raw, energetic experience. So as embarrassed as I was about this whole mental fear of mine, I did my best to stay with that felt sense experience. And I could locate it, a tightness in my chest. I could feel kind of the blood shunting away from my belly, because I was in an active, chronic fight or flight response. The more I could bring attention to that, the more I could explore the possibility of offering that some kindness, offering that some empathy, some compassion. And in those moments, I could feel the tension beginning to soothe a little bit. I could feel a little bit of a shift. So that allowed me to do the same process, but more through a cognitive process, another active way to investigate something that's arising, particularly with anxiety, is to explore what you're believing. Because oftentimes there's some form of delusion. You're believing something is true that isn't actually true. So I asked myself, what's the core belief? Like, what am I believing about this whole situation? And there was something in there around thinking, like, this is going to happen and I'm going to die. So there are some questions you can ask yourself. And Byron Katie is a beautiful way of kind of coding these questions. When you can identify a core belief, first you ask yourself, is it true? Is it true that this is going to happen and I'm going to die? Oh, and die a horrible death. That's the second part of that. And I had to take some time with that, because first blush was, well, there's a good chance, if this article is true, probably. But then I asked, but do I absolutely know that that's going to happen? thought, well, no, I don't absolutely know for sure that this is going to happen. So I could feel a little bit of a crack in that belief. The next question requires a little courage, where you ask yourself, well, what's it like when I believe it? So I refresh that inquiry. What does it feel like inside when I believe that this is going to happen and it's going to be horrible? And again, I could contact how my body was holding that whole thought form, that whole thought structure, the tightness, the kind of the chronic holding, the kind of lack of aliveness in my body, the sort of paralysis. The fourth question is the question that is kind of the cutting through question. And that question is, who are you without that belief? So as I sat with that, I could feel a huge sense of ease. I could feel a huge sense of possibility and a sense of like reconnecting with why I was moving down here. You know, to be with this wonderful person I had met and new possibilities, and it was such a whole flush through my system of feeling aliveness flowing again. So the first inquiry is around, how is your body holding that anxiety? To make contact with it, to bring it some empathy, some compassion. That can make a shift. When you're caught in chronic anxiety, if you can, when the conditions are right, ask yourself, what am I believing? And lean into that. It takes some rigor. Sense what it's like when you believe it. Ask who you are without that thought. You may notice some kind of a shift, some relief, maybe not permanently, but some shift. The third element, which I found quite helpful, which sort of came to me in a retreat, was realizing you have some control in your life. You can either change the externals or you can change the internals. And so I asked myself, if I move down to DC, what can I do externally about this whole situation? And really the only thing I could do was be prepared, have a disaster kit. And so I bought one. And I felt a lot better. I really did. I thought, well, I've done everything I can. And I can't tell you how much that made me relax. I still have it. And it's ready to go. And the other was the internals. What can I shift internally? But it's very, very helpful because I realized I have so little control over the externals. Just this little 5% that I have control over. But by attending to that, for me, it created a shift. So it's interesting how anxiety can feel like the enemy. But it's very interesting to think of how anxiety can be an ally. Your anxiety is looking out for you. It wants you to be safe. It's offering you messages that might be very, very helpful as you anticipate your future. It's more a question of how to be in partnership with your anxiety rather than to be in a sense of fight with your anxiety. There's so many wonderful stories out there of people who have transformed their relationship with chronic anxiety. There's a story of a baseball player who grew up, he was chronically anxious, but he always thought, as long as I can play baseball, everything's going to be okay. And then he blew out his knee. And as he turned to really investigate that, he saw that his system was in a constant state of preparing for trauma since as early as he could remember. And when he began to turn his attention to that sense of always being ready for doomsday, he began to feel an internal shift. There's a story of a gymnast, of a medal gymnast who worked with chronic anxiety. And in every meet, before she'd have a meet, she would cry uncontrollably and shake, and then would perform well. And she said that her shift came when a younger competitor told her and said, "You are my hero. I see you being so raw and so present, and you keep going." And she realized that she could be a role model for other people, and went on to really to become a teacher for others. I was a student who was paralyzed in high school by chronic anxiety, and he made his list of what helped him shift his relationship with it. And he said it was that he stopped the what-if thinking. And that's another sign of sort of the chronically anxious mind. What if this happens? What if this happens? And he started to explore a different sort of what if. What if it worked out? He explored what it meant to bring in a little more positive possibility in his life. And he found that exercise, diet, eliminating stimulants, many people find that their anxiety improves dramatically when they eliminate stimulants from their life. The nervous system has the possibility of calming, coming back into a little more homeostasis. And someone described their relationship with anxiety as they explored it through mindfulness as a shift in three things. They said, now that I'm really paying attention, a lot of times I can catch my thoughts before they start spiraling, before the papancha sets in, the proliferation. And that's one of the wonderful benefits of studying your mind. You can begin to see the patterns. You begin to recognize the stimulus and the response. This person went on to say, I noticed the default of my thoughts started to change from what could go wrong to what if it goes right? And the third thing, which I thought was so cool, this person said, I'm noticing that I'm beginning to notice the smaller pleasures of life. And someone described their relationship with anxiety beginning to shift simply through being more aware of their body. You know, bicycling to class, feeling his legs, pumping on the bicycle. You know, walking upstairs, to be aware of walking when you're walking. To be aware of breathing when you're breathing. This is one of the ways that we can begin to shift from future-oriented catastrophic thinking to the here and now, to this celebration of what's actually happening right now and right here. There's more I wanted to say on this topic, but I'm not going to get anxious about trying to get there. Other elements of working with anxiety are tied into some of the elements of the mind states of doubt and that ruthless critic. And perhaps we'll explore those a little bit more to look at how the opposite of doubt is having an understanding of self, cultivating a sense of faith. And it's always, I think, helpful to touch on one of the deepest teachings in Buddhist psychology, where the Buddha said a very intense statement. He said, nothing whatsoever is to be clung to as I or mine. When we feel anxiety and we're identified with anxiety, there's an element of clinging. And there's a world of difference between being anxious and being with your anxiety. When you can be with it, you can have tea with it. And you can begin to shift your relationship with it. So why don't we close with a short meditation, and I have a little poem. You might guide your attention to your breath. And you might take a moment just to acknowledge all you've got in play in your life. Your commitments, your responsibilities, your goals, your relationships, all the contracts you have with those around you. And you might at the same time just sense who you are in this moment, breathing freely. We'll close with this poem from Mary Oliver. I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I ever be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it, and I am, well, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing and gave it up and took my old body and went out into the morning and sang. As you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open. Thank you for your time and attention. May you and your anxiety have a great evening together. We have cookies and tea, I believe. If you'd like to be in the mailing list, please sign up in the back. Thanks as always for your support. In 2 weeks, I'll be offering a day-long retreat. It's called Meditative Journey. It's mindful movement, meditation, and deep relaxation. So it's all about yogic napping and all that can do for you. It's a very restorative day long.